Okay, so this is the third in these little explainer videos. And this one's about classical liberalism. And up to now, we've looked at the idea that liberalism has some core beliefs around human nature, society, the economy, and the state. They're all things which liberals agree on. And here is where we begin to look at liberals go off in two separate directions, two strands. One classical liberal for the 19th century and 18th century, and 20th century liberalism is more what we call modern liberalism. Okay, when we think about these ones, then I often start by using this analogy of Jekyll and Hyde. And you might remember the story of Jekyll and Hyde is based upon Jekyll was the doctor who was an upstanding, rational, scientist-type character who really wanted to experiment in order to create things which were better for humanity. He makes this potion. The potion goes terribly wrong, and he drinks it and becomes by night Mr. Hyde, a monstrous character who does terrible things. And I think we can say things which are similar about classical liberalism, because it has some of the best and worst features of the way in which we think about politics. So we can look at that by looking at these two statements. This first one in green is about the poverty of the incapable, the starvation of the idle, the shouldering aside of the weak, and it describes it as being part of a far-seeing benevolence. In other words, this is supposed to happen. It's good for society that some people, the weak, fall by the wayside because that helps the strong become stronger as well. If we use the state to help the weak, actually all we're going to do is make them worse off because we're going to make them dependent and even lazier or less able. And we're also going to make the people who have been successful less capable, less able, less successful than they would have been. So for lots of people, that's an unpalatable statement. It means basically let the poor starve, right? The blue one's interesting, though. The blue one suggests, okay, well, what about people who are unfree? And in the 19th century, lots of people were thinking, if it's true that no one can be perfectly free till all are free, what about all the people in India who are part of the British Empire, or parts of Africa who are who were colonials and in bondage to Britain? Those people ought to be set free. We shouldn't have any business telling other countries or human beings in other countries that they must do our bidding for us. So that might be something which these days we think about as something which we want to agree with. That's a more agreeable sort of statement. But as the Jekyll and Hyde thing suggests, both of these are features of classical liberalism. In fact, not only are they both features of classical liberalism, they both come from the same person, who I like to think looks a little bit like Mr. Hyde, or maybe, in transition towards becoming Mr. Hyde. But Herbert Spencer was a 19th century liberal who was the author of both of these statements and both of these opinions. And it's telling us that classical liberalism therefore has some things which we would think of these days as positive features about freedom and maximizing individuals' ability to do what they want without a government or a state telling them what to do. But also it means that some people are free to starve, and that might be less agreeable to us. Okay, so what we're going to try and do is look at these four features of classical liberalism. When you're revising this, it's easy to break them down into these four chunks. We'll try and do a minute or two on each of these. Okay, so let's take the first one, revolutionary potential. There is something about liberalism. These days, if we think about the Liberal Democrats, thinking they're not particularly revolutionary. But at the time, when Locke wrote in the 17th century, government should be the servant of the people and not the master, what he was talking about was the idea that people themselves should be the ones who give consent to kings and queens, and not that people belong as subjects to kings and queens. That the kings and queens are sovereign, and that they look after the people as if they are the parents over them, and that therefore the people are somehow inferior to them. The whole point of individuals having natural rights which can't be taken away from them being sovereign to themselves is that they are the ones who decide whether or not a government looks after them. Not looks after them is the wrong word. Whether or not a government protects their rights and maximizes the individual freedom of everybody. And if you want proof of what this looks like in practice, then the American Constitution is a good example. Indeed, before that, the American Declaration of Independence, because it says in it that when a king, like George III they were talking about, begins to take away these rights, begins to act as if they're a despot, and they use the word despotism, then the people, and it's about the people of America, don't just have the right to get rid of that king. They have a duty to get rid of that type of ruler and then replace them with another sort of ruler. So the implications for this revolutionary potential are huge for us, because it means that with this consent, we then begin later on to think about the idea of how do you show that consent? How do you show, how do you give a government legitimacy? Well, you elect it. You choose to elect it frequently. And in the American Constitution, there is provision for electing governments every 4 years, so that government will always be able to say that it has consent, and indeed even more regularly for members of Congress as well. Okay, so the second key feature of classical liberalism is this idea of negative liberty. To be honest, the idea of negative liberty doesn't really come along until the 1960s, or at least that phrase, that term isn't coined until Isaiah Berlin comes up with it. But Voltaire and Montesquieu and John Locke would have recognized that what it really means is, when we say we want people to be free, what we're talking about is we want them to be free from things, free from restraint by government, free from the possibility of being locked up without trial, free from a king coming along and taking away your property from you. And that's because, as individuals with natural rights, they thought that people were autonomous individuals who nonetheless were able to interact with other people in order to help them maximize their liberties, their freedom, and in order to help each other develop in a society. Why does this matter? Well, one of the biggest implications for us is about tolerance. So if you want, this is a very Dr. Jekyll type of aspect of classical liberalism. It's a very positive thing, because what it's saying is, look, so long as you don't do me any harm and take away my rights, then I've got no reason why I should want to infringe your liberty or stop you doing what you want to do, or saying what you want to say, or believing what you want to believe as well. And governments don't have any role. I shouldn't have any say in doing that. Voltaire, when he was writing about these things, was thinking about the way in which Protestants were persecuted in France by a Catholic church and a Catholic government. And if you spoke out against the Catholic Church, you were seen as a blasphemer. You would be put on a wheel and have your limbs broken in front of a crowd before you were eventually executed. And so for Voltaire, this idea that the state was doing this in some way which was positive for society was false. It was a lie. They were doing it in order to consolidate their own power over people, to make people subject to them. So this is about limiting government as well, and limiting what the scope of government is. The scope of government is to do nothing other than help you protect your natural rights, and it's not there to interfere in what you believe in or what you say. So if that's another Dr. Jekyll thing, a kind of positive feature of early classical liberalism, this one might be more problematic, the idea of a minimal state. It certainly sounds like a good idea. Jefferson, who was one of the authors of the American Constitution, describes it as government that is best is that which governs least. And when government grows, our liberty withers. And he was thinking about the British government that he'd got rid of before, which had taxed people without their consent, which had interfered in the way in which they traded with each other. And he was particularly worried about the new American government if it was going to stop him from making money in the way in which he wanted, and in the business of how farmers like him in Virginia went about determining themselves and reaching their own goals. Locke is the one who says that the sole purpose of government is to protect the right of property, and it shouldn't be there to do anything else. So, in other words, not to interfere in what you believe in and not to interfere in what you say as well, but also no other activities. So what do you need a government to do? You need it to protect your property by stopping invaders, so you need an army. You need to stop people who haven't got property coming and taking your property away from you, so you need a police force. And you also need to make sure that there is a rule of law, and that therefore the state can't take away your property from you, and the state is more or less checked itself. We should say, I suppose, as well, that the state should stop other people who've got more power from acquiring too much power themselves. So there's some provision for regulating monopolies. But beyond that, the state's job is to get out of the way of business. Now, that's got some big implications. If we think about property, one of the things we're going to look at later on when we think about criticizing liberalism in general, especially when we look at modern liberalism, is that what do we think about people who haven't got property? How do we look after those people and manage to sort out their freedoms? And as society becomes increasingly unequal, in a 19th century capitalist society, then people begin to ask questions about, well, aren't the people who've got more property, more wealth, actually making it more difficult for people who've got no property to live and enjoy their individual freedoms? But there's another aspect, and even more obvious when we think about people like Jefferson as well. Because at the time when Jefferson was saying this, when he was writing the very Constitution, he was a slave owner. He owned people as property. And that creates a problem for early classical liberalism. This is very definitely a Mr. Hyde thing. That what do you do if the property that you want to have protected, your right to that property, actually involves other people? What about their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? What about their natural rights? Well, the solution to this conundrum is to say, well, they're not really people. They're inferior, they're subhuman, and therefore they can be treated as livestock like other people. So here's a Mr. Hyde feature that actually classical liberalism gives birth to: modern racism as we know it, and the characterization or the classification of some human beings as not being as being inferior to white Europeans who dominated society at the time. Okay, the fourth feature of classical liberalism then is this idea of laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire, French just meaning do nothing, don't intervene, allow the economy to run on its own. And I mentioned previously that Adam Smith is the economic architect of this, but it's only following on from what Locke and other 18th century philosophers had already talked about in terms of allowing individual freedom for autonomous individuals to interact with each other, in this case in a marketplace. And what Smith thought was not only that this was freedom from, it was, government had no right to interfere in people's use of property, but that in so doing it was actually going to make society better. That it would make society better because people would be able to regulate their own prices. Therefore, the market would be the thing which properly distributed by using the rules of supply and demand, whether people needed things, what people needed, when they needed it. It would guarantee that people can keep control of their own property and make choices about how they use that property, or indeed how they use their labor in the economic system as well. And as people prospered in this, then they developed surplus wealth. And that wealth would do two things. One, they could invest the money in building their business or building their operation in the economy. That would create jobs. That would maximize other people's freedoms as well, or give people the opportunity to maximize and develop their own freedoms as well. And so this economic system was growing liberty as it went. But the other feature of it is that it also create wealthy people. And if you create wealthy people with surplus wealth that they don't need to use for their business or subsistence, then they can use that in order to give it to people who are less well off. So this would not only help the rich, but a thriving capitalist economy in a along classical liberal principles would actually benefit the poor as well. What you shouldn't do in this case is tax or make any kind of impediments to this kind of free trade, because anything that intervenes in the way in which the economy works is going to stop people becoming prosperous, in itself then create that surplus wealth being produced. And if you use it to give it to poor people, then it's only going to mean that they become stunted and dependent upon the state and less likely to exercise their own choices and their own abilities, develop their own abilities in order to become more fruitful in a capitalist sort of society. Now, we're going to see later on that when we talk about an evaluation of classical liberals, there are plenty of other liberals, modern liberals, who will come along and say, well, but if you're poor, then there are all sorts of ways in which you don't get to exercise your choice. And your absence of choice then allows other people to have more power over you. And that doesn't maximize your liberty. In fact, that limits your liberty. We'll talk about positive liberty as a counterpoint to this idea later on. Okay, those are your 4 key principles of classical liberalism. And as usual, hopefully that will help you kind of add to your notes on your handout. And if you've got any other questions about them, then you can drop me an email or take part in one of the Google Meets.